Last week I treated you to Jack T. Chick's flagship gospel tract, This Was Your Life, and a fancy piece of work it is, just brimming with insights into the tormented human psyche and its probable eternal destiny. I think you might get a kick out of Chick's most widely circulated anti-evolution tract, Big Daddy with a question mark. It's going to take me 2 Sunday school lessons to get through this prodigy of creationist comic book literature. This groundbreaking literary specimen appeared in 1972, a detail that will become important during next week's lesson. This tract makes frequent reference to Dr. Dino and his creation science seminars, with Dr. Dino being, of course, the execrable Kent Hovind, who spent a decade of his worthless life behind bars on account of tax evasion. He's back among us, pushing his dinosaur adventureland in Alabama. Don't go there. This tract is a specimen of a David and Goliath genre popular among evangelical Christians, the unlikely hero appearing in the guise of what would appear to be a mere child, toppling the Philistine giant with ease, and with the help of the creator of a trillion galaxies, of course, and winning the hearts and minds of all those around him. My sister sent me a fine representative specimen of the genre while I was teaching at the University of Arkansas, supposing, I guess, that it had relevance to my situation and what she imagined me to be doing to my students. Here's the tale as furnished from that quarter. This is a true story of something that happened just a few years ago at USC. There was a professor of philosophy there who was a deeply committed atheist. His primary goal for one required class was to spend the entire semester attempting to prove that God couldn't exist. His students were always afraid to argue with him because of his impeccable logic. For 20 years he had taught this class, and no one had ever had the courage to go against him. Sure, some had argued in class at times, but no one had really gone against him. No one would go against him because he had a reputation. At the end of every semester, on the last day, he would say to his class of 300 students, "If there's anyone here who still believes in Jesus, stand up." I thought he was trying to prove that God didn't exist. Oh well. In 20 years, no one had ever stood up. They knew what he was going to do next. He would say, "Because anyone who does believe in God is a fool. If God existed, he could stop this piece of chalk from hitting the ground and breaking. Such a simple task to prove that he is God, and yet he can't do it." And every year he would drop the chalk onto the tile floor of the classroom, and it would shatter into 100 pieces. The students could do nothing but stop and stare. Most of the students were convinced that God couldn't exist. Certainly a number of Christians had slipped through, but for 20 years they had been too afraid to stand up. Well, a few years ago, there was a freshman who happened to get enrolled in the class. He was a Christian and had heard the stories about this professor. He had to take the class because it was one of the required classes for his major, and he was afraid. But for 3 months that semester, he prayed every morning that he would have the courage to stand up no matter what the professor said or what the class thought. Nothing they said or did could ever shatter his faith, he hoped. Finally, the day came. The professor said, "If there is anyone here who still believes in God, stand up." The professor and the class of 300 people looked at him shocked as he stood up at the back of the classroom. The professor shouted, "You fool! If God existed, he could keep this piece of chalk from breaking when it hit the ground." He proceeded to drop the chalk, but as he did, it slipped out of his fingers, off his shirt cuff, onto the pleat of his pants, down his leg, and off his shoe. As it hit the ground, it simply rolled away, unbroken. The professor's jaw dropped as he stared at the chalk. He looked up at the young man and then ran out of the lecture hall. The young man who had stood up proceeded to walk to the front of the room and share his faith in Jesus for the next half hour. 300 students stayed and listened as he told of God's love for them and of his power through Jesus. This highly believable story has apparently been around in some form or another since the 1920s, and if you will turn over a few rocks on the interwebs, you'll find a number of versions of it, with the variants including an egg and a glass beaker, two other eminently breakable objects. USC professors who have been interviewed over the years regarding this tall tale have unanimously agreed that no such professor ever taught there, nor did any such miracle ever happen in any of its classrooms. The Chick tract up for review today is an illustrated variant of that story, a variant that involves nothing breakable other than the professor's ego. Here's the cover, Big Daddy with a question mark, an ape-like figure with a face half human, half simian, eating a banana. When we flip to the first page, we discover that the illustration on the cover is actually a framed portrait of our father hanging behind a professor of some sort who's setting up his students for failure by quizzing them on their beliefs. I suppose that might be an indication that he's a professor of philosophy, since beliefs are absolutely irrelevant to any kind of science class, but I'm not so sure how appropriate a question like that would be in a philosophy class either. I can assure you, however, before I turn the page, that no professor who acted this way in front of any class would retain that academic position for any appreciable amount of time. That also goes for the narcissistic professor in the despicable cinematic abortion God's Not Dead, featuring Hercules Sorbo. Watch that if you have the stomach for it. You'll certainly see the culture war through a lens so distorted that the result is like a hall of funny mirrors. "We do, sir," cries his class of compliant sycophants, most of whom are, in all likelihood, far more concerned with their GPA than with what might or might not be true. But one lone voice crying in the wilderness, young David to this professorial Goliath, dares to demur. "By the way, why are all these students, including young David here, addressing this academic pulpiteer as sir? Anytime one of my students addresses me that way, I put the kibosh on it immediately. Addressing someone as sir is appropriate, as far as I can tell, only in a military context, as determined by rank." Our professor's having none of this uppity young upstart's wholesome Christian attitude. Just look at those drops of sweat flying from his overheated brow. "You can get out of my class." Note the emphasis. "After you've apologized to everyone for your rudeness and ignorance, we might let you back in." As we will see next week, this little outburst will not age well. Again, I want to stress that no such professor ever existed, could not exist, in fact. But the Chick tract certainly exists, and a lot of people take it seriously, so it might be important to note a not-so-subtle shift here. It's not the professor alone who might let you back in, it's we. The professor has done exactly what preacher men everywhere do Sunday after Sunday, and more often if they can get away with it. Draw them in, let them think they've got a vested interest in it too. Get the general population on your side. Get them to identify with you. It's exactly what Donald Trump and other demagogues do. This tract just oozes projection, as does Chick's entire published output. Well, that was sudden. Bang! The prof here has gone from one fevered state of mind to its apparent opposite without any transition whatsoever. Makes one wonder what his lectures must be like. Instead of merely getting rid of the aggravation, he's going to make sport of it. In the process, teaching his entire class, along with this young prophet of God, just what's what in academia. This will not end well. On second thought, perhaps I was a bit hasty. I think I will systematically tear your little beliefs to shreds in front of the entire class. Thank you, sir. May I have another? Crazy, man. Sit down. What makes you think evolution is untrue? Because the Bible says that each kind... Ha ha! Hold it, you fanatic! I could have you jailed for that. How dare you even mention the word Bible in this school? You know it's unscientific. If you talk to me, it will only be in scientific terms. Do you understand? Just look at this ticking time bomb, his hands frozen in a rictus of strangulation, ready to choke someone by the neck until dead, with hot anger flashing from his head while he half threatens the student with jail time. I could have you jailed for that. Well, no, he couldn't. And no sane professor would ever say anything remotely like that. If I threatened one of my students with imprisonment for voicing a contrarian opinion, I would deserve to be fired forthwith, and in any university worthy of the name, that would absolutely happen. But just look at the footnote here, a reference to Dr. Dino's claim that it has never been against the law to teach the Bible or creationism in public schools. First, what kind of classroom is this anyway? Is it a public school classroom? I could have sworn it was a university classroom. In fact, my impression will be borne out near the end of this adventure, so why does this claim about public schools appear here? More importantly, Kent Hovind's claim is extremely misleading. It most certainly is illegal to teach the Bible and or creationism in any public school science classroom. A large body of jurisprudence spanning half a century makes that clear. Creationism in any of its several disguises is not permitted in a secular science curriculum. However, it certainly is the case that the Bible and its creation stories can be taught in public school classes dedicated to the comparative study of world religions, with Christianity and its particular myths holding no priority over the myths of other religious traditions. In fact, I think that's a very good idea and would certainly like to see such courses implemented as a matter of routine in public high schools all across the country, because, as the old saying goes, if you teach students about one religion, you indoctrinate them. If you teach them about several, you inoculate them. And I trust it goes without saying that I believe the most appropriate teachers of such classes would be atheists, because they wouldn't have a dog in any of those sectarian fights. Young man, the evidence is overwhelming. All of the schools teach it. It's accepted everywhere. DNA proves it. Science proves it. Carbon-14 proves it. Facts, facts, facts. Huxley, G. Gaylord Simpson, Darwin, even National Geographic and Time magazines know it. Well, National Geographic and Time are not scientific publications, and an appeal to that kind of authority is even more ludicrous than invoking Darwin, Huxley, and Simpson. Evolution is true, even if everyone who's ever written or spoken about it has gotten much of it wrong. Facts remain facts whether or not we understand them fully, and certainly whether or not they make us uncomfortable. So the student's got something up his sleeve. Sir, and here's his little doggy nugget. The student frames his leading question, are there not 6 types of evolution? And the idiot professor agrees. Well, what kind of class is this exactly? Those 6 types of evolution are a fever dream of Kent Hovind. No biology curriculum has ever agreed with this, and it is, after all, biological evolution that is at issue here, at least for the moment. Let's move on. Only the last one, that's microevolution, changes within kinds, has been observed and can be called science, and it's not really evolution, it's variation within a kind. He's got a point there. Yeah, he doesn't actually. I mean, variation within a kind, whatever a kind is precisely what evolution is. But anyhow, I don't like your attitude. Let's discuss prehistoric man. Here is the first and most famous clue to early man, the Neanderthal skull cap. Oh boy. Yeah, Neanderthals were certainly among the first of the ancient humans to be discovered, but I'm not aware of any case that's ever been made for their being ancestors of modern humans. Of course, it is true that I, along with most other people of European descent, do carry the genes of Homo neanderthalensis, so Neanderthals were among my ancestors, but that's not what's meant here. This suggests that Homo sapiens is a daughter species of Homo neanderthalensis, and that is certainly not the case. They were more like cousins who lived side by side for a couple of 100,000 years before the latter went extinct around 35,000 years ago. Modern dating methods show man to be older than Darwin could have imagined. Yes, human ancestry stretches much farther back in time than Darwin could have known or even imagined, because during the mid-19th century, the only known ages of rocks were relative ages, ages of some rock layers relative to others, largely determined on the basis of Nicholas Steno's principle of stratigraphic succession. But absolute ages could not be known until the discovery of radioactive decay and the insight that the decay of heavy elements locked inside impermeable mineral structures could be a reliable indicator of the absolute age of a specimen within established error bars. As a result, we now know things about human evolution that Darwin could not possibly have guessed at, partly because he could not know how long the Earth had been around. About 4 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, Lord Kelvin calculated the age of the Earth at about 100 million years, and certainly not more than 200 million. But he was basing his calculations on such factors as erosion and planetary cooling, both of which are countered by tectonic uplift and radioactive decay of heavy elements in the mantle. But those were only discovered after Lord Kelvin's calculations. Everything about this panel is irrelevant, including those illustrations of Propleopithecus and Proconsul. Those were both ancient primates, possibly standing very near the split between Old World monkeys and modern apes. Those primates were not human, however, and no scientist has ever claimed that they were. They are two entries in an ever-growing catalog of fossil specimens of the vast primate family, and one might rightly imagine human-like eyes staring out of those fossil orbits. But then all apes have human-like eyes, or, better put, all humans have ape-like eyes. The much more recent Australopithecus afarensis, the most famous fossil of which was dubbed Lucy by discoverer Donald Johanson in 1974, actually ranged in age from 2.9 million years before present to 3.9 million, so there's more range there than Chick knew. More importantly, Lucy is not our oldest known ancestor. She's instead one of our oldest known ancestors with clearly transitional features between the other extant great apes and humans. She walked upright. Her dentition pattern was about halfway between those of modern humans, who have a more arch-shaped dentition, and the other apes whose dentition pattern is more nearly rectangular, and so forth. Note her genus, however. Australopithecus means southern ape. Afarensis fixes the geographical position of the first fossil discoveries of this species at the Afar Depression in Ethiopia. Lucy was not human. The first known human was Homo habilis, in all likelihood ancestral to the long-lasting Homo erectus, who are definitely the ancestral species of both Neanderthals and modern humans, along with a dozen or so other human species that have long since disappeared. The genus name Homo indicates human. Any animal with that generic name is a human. Of course, our young warrior, having armed himself with creationist talking points, counters with a risible distortion of one of Richard Leakey's finds in Kenya. The rock in which the skull and other fragments were found was actually 2.6 million years old, and the skull capacity was around 800 cubic centimeters, a little more than half the size of that of the average modern human. As far as the claim that most experts now agree Lucy was nothing but an unusual chimpanzee goes, that's total nonsense. Whatever she was, she certainly was no chimpanzee nor an ancestor of chimps, and even if she isn't the direct ancestor of modern humans, she's certainly very much like the population living at the time that was that ancestral root. The documentation offered for these astonishing claims is a Kent Hovind seminar, which you couldn't pay me to watch. As far as chasing down those claims on the web, I find both only on creationist websites. Brothers and sisters, human evolution is fascinating. It's the most important single key to what we are. It should not be dismissed so cavalierly by the likes of Jack T. Chick. By the way, I wouldn't recommend watching any of so-called Dr. Hovind's videos, not unless you're really, really high and want to find out just how much laughter your corpus can endure. Kent Hovind is no more a doctor of any kind than I'm a scientist of any kind. To hell with this fraud, this con man. Pieced together by fragmentary fossil evidence, science can show the stages of man's long march from ape-like ancestors to sapiens, with wonderful names like proconsul, Australopithecus afarensis, to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus, and on to modern man. Okay, I suppose this settles it. This is definitely a biology class of some kind, with emphasis during this part of the semester on evolutionary biology, and the professor has his spiel all polished because he's spouted it 1,000 times before while waving that little bone in the air. Well, he's apparently made some reference to some chart that we didn't see because... Sir, I have in my possession a similar chart showing some amazing things which are rarely made public. May I show it? This should be interesting. Yes, let's see it. Science always has the answers. I don't know of a single scientist who's ever said anything like, science has all the answers. If it ever did arrive at all the answers, it would grind to a halt and disappear. But that's not the nature of the world at all, and scientists know it. Every question answered raises a dozen more. Science is a never-ending pursuit. Chick is projecting. It's religious leaders who imagine that their religion has all the answers and thus need never change. Science is certainly not a religion, as creationists claim. Our professor here might have been referring to this chart, published in 1965 in the Time Life volume Early Man. The illustration is by Rudolf Zeilinger, and a version of it hung in many classrooms during the later 60s. I'm pretty sure I've seen it myself on some classroom wall at Clarksville High School. The timeline begins during the Miocene epoch with the appearance of Pliopithecus around 23 million years ago and traces human ancestry from them until the present day. There are plenty of problems with this overall excellent illustration, the main one of which is its linear presentation, which both includes humans who were not our ancestors and suggests a degree of teleology that is simply not present in any evolutionary process. The human family, both extinct and extant, is probably better represented as a tree with many branches, only one of those branches still viable, and perhaps due soon to go extinct in turn. Here's the student's alternative chart, and is it ever a doozy? One by one, no, none of the experts agree that Lucy was just a 3-foot-tall chimpanzee. Lucy was a member of the long-extinct species Australopithecus afarensis. Why not have a look at the Smithsonian Institution's excellent article on Australopithecus afarensis, who may well have been ancestral to our species? I'll furnish a link in the info bar below. Yes, the type specimen for Homo heidelbergensis is a mandible that was discovered in 1907 and thought to be between 400,000 and 600,000 years old. There have been dozens of fossils of this species recovered from sites as far-flung as South Africa and England. This is the species sometimes referred to as archaic Homo sapiens. Hard to tell what Chick's point is here. Nebraska Man was an honest mistake. A geologist and rancher named Harold Cook found a tooth in Nebraska in 1917 which he thought looked vaguely human. In 1922, he turned it over to Henry Fairchild Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History, for identification. Osborn pronounced it an extinct species of North American ape, and his colleagues not only agreed, but suggested some of the tooth's features indicated that it lay more nearly on the human side of the ape lineage than that of the other extant apes. But of course, there had never been any evidence found of primate habitation of North America north of Mexico. The fact that it was such an outlier made it unlikely from the start that the identification and description would stand. And indeed, within 5 years it was withdrawn, the tooth finally having been determined to have been the tooth of an extinct peccary. Again, an honest mistake, and one that the scientific community itself corrected. Piltdown Man was a hoax perpetrated not by people who were trying to prove evolution, but by people who were trying to discredit it. Again, it was scientists who eventually uncovered the fraud and went public with the fact that Piltdown Man wasn't the real deal. Science, unlike religion, is self-correcting. And yes, the original fossil of Peking man, Homo erectus pekinensis, was lost. Nevertheless, excellent casts were made of the fossil before it disappeared, so the specimen is still available for examination. Again, what's Chick's point here? As far as this wild-ass claim about Neanderthals goes, I can find no reference whatsoever to this alleged zoologist who made the claim other than on creationist websites. No surprises there. But it doesn't matter anyway, because the remains of over 300 European Neanderthals have been found and curated. And in any event, Homo neanderthalensis has never been reckoned as an ancestor of modern human beings, but rather as a cousin. The one and only reference I can find online to New Guinea Man as a fossil hominid is in the very Chick tract under examination here. And the region just north of Australia is a strange way to describe Papua New Guinea, since there's a strait about 150 kilometers wide lying between the two land masses. Cro-Magnon man was indeed one of the first of the truly modern humans, the first with a prominent chin. So, someone was always going to be the first, right? Kind of nice to have fossil documentation, isn't it? What is the point of this entry in this bullshit chart anyway? And of course, the last entry is nothing but an insult. A professor with a suspiciously pronounced paunch, probably a beer belly. To hell with this arrogant little dick and his idiotic chart. But the professor seems to think it might be real. That thought bubble over his head indicates serious panic. Time for plan B. He's killing me. I gotta play it cool. All of these layers of the earth are millions of years different in age. We can tell the age of these layers from the fossils they contain. But sir, how do you date the fossils? That's a good question. We can tell the age of the fossils since we know the age of the layer of rock where they were found. Sir, isn't that circular reasoning? Well, the student who clearly did not enroll in this university to learn a damn thing has made the claim that the dating of fossils and the rocks they're found in is circular reasoning, which is an extra special brand of bullshit, and he's not even going to support that claim, so I don't suppose it would do much good to try to counter it here. But this is the story in a nutshell. No, a fossil by itself cannot establish the age of a stratum unless it's an index fossil with a known distribution that is very wide and also a relatively narrow range in time. And how is that determined? While most sedimentary layers cannot be dated using radiometric dating techniques, igneous rocks certainly can be. And we live on such a tectonically active planet that there are plenty of igneous deposits cross-cutting sedimentary deposits or separating them in time. And with enough of those, you can very easily establish upper and lower time limits quite accurately for a particular stratum. Then, if that eminently datable sedimentary deposit contains fossils that are distinctive, and the same fossils are found 100 miles away in a sedimentary deposit that isn't cross-cut by igneous features, one can reasonably extrapolate the age of that second deposit, especially, as I just indicated, if the fossil is a recognized index species. I think that's about enough for today, brothers and sisters. I'll return to this point next week and finish this abomination. Plenty of yucks lie ahead, so tune in.